August 7th, 1956. Cali, Colombia. Just after 1 a.m, the city slept beneath a humid blanket of summer air. Then, without warning, the night tore apart. A white flash split the sky, followed by a roar so violent it erased the sound of everything else. Streets vanished. Buildings folded inward. Windows shattered miles away. The heart of Cali became a crater of flame and dust, where entire neighborhoods ceased to exist in a single instant. When dawn came, the city was unrecognizable. So how could an ordinary night end in unimaginable ruin? The warning signs. In the days leading up to August 7th, Cali pulsed with its usual rhythm, a city alive with commerce, noise, and heat. Vendors crowded the markets, buses rattled through narrow streets, children played barefoot in the courtyards of the San Nicolas and Obrera districts. Few paid attention when a convoy of army trucks rumbled quietly through town late that afternoon. They had come from Buenaventura, the Pacific port, carrying dynamite intended for road construction in the mountains. To most, it was an unremarkable sight. Military trucks passed often, and in 1950s Colombia, the presence of soldiers meant safety. But these 7 vehicles were different. Each truck carried thousands of kilograms of explosives, more than 40 tons in total, packed in wooden crates and covered with canvas tarps. There were no warning labels, no escorts to clear the route, no safety perimeter once they stopped for the night. By dusk, the convoy had reached Cali's 7th Avenue. The drivers, weary from the winding mountain roads, pulled into a rail yard near the downtown district to rest. They parked close together, unaware that beneath them ran a maze of fuel lines and sewer tunnels that could carry fire like veins beneath the city. Residents nearby noticed the trucks but thought little of it. Some saw soldiers unloading supplies and assumed the army was preparing for maneuvers. Others said they smelled fuel or heard something shifting inside one of the trucks. Still, no one questioned the decision to leave so much dynamite in the heart of a crowded urban neighborhood. Warnings had come before, quietly and always ignored. Months earlier, engineers from the Ministry of Public Works had raised concerns about the transport of explosives through populated areas. There were no specialized containers, no trained handlers, no regulation that kept volatile cargo away from civilian centers. The paperwork, as one official later admitted, was as explosive as the cargo itself. But Colombia in the 1950s was a nation in transition, industrializing, rebuilding, and still scarred by the political violence. Bureaucracy often moved slower than the trucks it tried to control. As night fell, the air cooled. Street lamps flickered over the parked convoy. The soldiers shared cigarettes, then drifted to nearby homes and bars to sleep. Around them, families closed their shutters against the summer insects. A few children peered curiously at the olive-green vehicles, unaware they were looking at a ticking bomb that stretched across 40 city blocks. Somewhere in that quiet, a fuse was metaphorically burning, invisible, unheeded, and nearly ready to ignite. The disaster unfolds. It was just after 1 a.m. when the first shock rippled through Cali's sleeping core. Dogs began barking in the distance. Somewhere, a truck engine coughed to life. Then silence again. The strange, almost expectant pause that comes before catastrophe. In the rail yard along 7th Avenue, 7 army trucks sat in a line, their heavy tires pressed into the dusty ground. The air was still, heavy with humidity, and the faint scent of gasoline lingered from the day's traffic. A watchman at a nearby warehouse later told investigators he saw a blue spark, as if metal had scraped metal in the dark. Others claimed they heard a pop, like a tire bursting. Whatever it was, the chain reaction began in that instant. A fire erupted beneath one of the trucks, small at first, a thin orange tongue licking at the undercarriage. Within seconds, it spread to the crates of dynamite stacked in the bed. Soldiers scrambled from their makeshift camp, shouting for water, for sand, for anything to stop the blaze. But the fire didn't just grow, it roared. The dynamite began to sweat and hiss. A chemical reaction had already started. Those who lived nearby woke to the shouts and the flicker of light. Housewives peered from windows, confused. Men stepped into the street in their undershirts. One witness remembered seeing the soldiers running, waving their arms, warning people to get back. But by then, it was far too late. At 1:06 a.m, the first explosion tore through the heart of Cali. The blast was so powerful it vaporized the line of trucks and carved a crater more than 50 feet deep into the street. The shockwave raced outward at hundreds of miles per hour. Entire rows of houses disintegrated in a single breath. People were thrown from their beds, concrete fractured, walls folded, roofs sailed into the night. In the nearby Obrero and San Nicolas neighborhoods, entire families vanished without a trace. The detonation flattened everything within 40 city blocks. Those who weren't killed outright staggered into the streets, dazed, their skin burned and shredded by glass. The air was filled with dust and screams, and then came the second explosion. It wasn't dynamite this time, but the infrastructure itself. Gas lines ruptured beneath the ground, igniting into roaring pillars of flame. Transformers blew apart one after another, sending arcs of electricity snapping through the ruins. Fire leapt from house to house. By 1:10 a.m., downtown Cali was an inferno. Witnesses miles away saw a flash on the horizon and thought a volcano had erupted. In Palmyra, 20 miles to the north, the shockwave shattered windows. In Buga, people ran from their homes, convinced the end of the world had come. At the San Juan de Dios hospital, nurses rushed to the windows as debris rained onto the roof. The glass exploded inwards, slicing through curtains and walls. Doctors grabbed flashlights, shouting over the din. Within minutes, the first wave of survivors stumbled through the doors, burned, bleeding, carrying others who could no longer move. The explosion had struck so close to the center of Cali that no single district could be called the epicenter. The destruction formed a jagged wound across the map, from the rail yard through the commercial district across entire neighborhoods of modest homes and workshops. In the chaos, rumors began to spread. Some said the army had been attacked. Others whispered of sabotage, that communist guerrillas had planted bombs. Still others believed an earthquake had opened beneath the city. Radio operators tried to reach Bogotá, but the lines were down. For nearly an hour, Cali was cut off from the rest of the world. Those who survived described scenes that defy comprehension. A bus filled with passengers was lifted from the road and torn apart mid-air. A tram car was thrown onto its side like a toy. A nearby school collapsed into itself, trapping the night watchman inside. Fires burned so hot they melted the cobblestones. In the ruins of San Nicolas, a mother searched for her children among the wreckage of her home. She later told investigators she could hear them crying beneath the debris, faintly, like echoes, but could not reach them. The smell of gunpowder and burning oil filled the air. Every few minutes, smaller explosions rippled through the wreckage as leftover dynamite and fuel caught fire. By 2 a.m., the city's few surviving firefighters were already overwhelmed. Their trucks had been destroyed in the initial blast, and those still standing had no water pressure. The pipelines were shattered. Men formed human chains, passing buckets from the river, but it was useless. The flames devoured everything in their path. Soldiers from the 3rd Brigade stationed on the outskirts of the city rushed toward the glow on the horizon. When they arrived, they found streets turned into trenches filled with rubble and corpses. The smell of charred flesh hung thick over the ruins. Commanders gave up any pretense of organization. The first priority was simply to pull the living from the fires. By dawn, the smoke hung low over Cali like a black ceiling. The rising sun turned it a dull rust red. Survivors moved like shadows through the wreckage, silent except for the distant sobs that carried over the heat. In the crater where the trucks had once stood, there was nothing, only twisted steel and a hole big enough to swallow a building. The first reporters arrived from Bogotá that morning, travelling in jeeps and on foot where the roads had collapsed. They described a city that no longer existed, a Cali of ghosts, they called it. Entire neighbourhoods had been reduced to grey ash. Churches were flattened, hospitals overflowed. There were too many dead to count, and more still missing beneath the rubble. The exact moment of the explosion would be recorded with chilling precision, 1:06. 6 a.m., August 7th, 1956, but the scale of the destruction was beyond measurement. In one instant, more than 40 tons of military dynamite had detonated at the center of a living city, and the horror was only beginning. Morning broke over Cali like a funeral shroud. The air was thick with dust and the metallic scent of blood. Smoke curled from every direction, rising in hundreds of thin black columns that merged into a single choking cloud over the skyline. Birds circled high above the devastation, disoriented by the smell of burning wood, flesh and gasoline. From the surrounding hills, families who had fled in the night looked down upon their city and wept. What had once been the vibrant heart of Colombia's third largest city was now a wasteland. Streets were gone, replaced by trenches, open craters and smoking debris. The explosion had carved a scar through the city that stretched more than a kilometre long. When daylight revealed the full extent of the destruction, even the soldiers who had fought through the night stood in silence. Their boots crunched over glass that covered the streets like frost. In some areas, the heat was still so intense that the soles of their shoes stuck to the ground. Bodies lay everywhere, some burned beyond recognition, others frozen in positions that spoke of their final moments. Hands raised, faces turned, arms outstretched. Families huddled around what was left of their homes, calling names into the rubble. Every few minutes another cry would rise. Someone had found a loved one, alive or dead. In the heart of the crater, where the trucks had exploded, the earth still smouldered. The blast had been so violent that the dynamite fused with the soil itself. Investigators would later describe it as a pit of molten snow. Pieces of the trucks were found more than a mile away, an axle embedded in a school wall, a tyre hanging from a tree, a soldier's helmet wedged into the side of a church. The first rescue efforts were chaotic. There was no central command, no plan, only instinct and desperation. Men tore at the debris with their bare hands, searching for movement. Women formed lines to carry buckets of water from broken mains. Priests moved quietly among the ruins, giving last rites to the dying. As word spread, help began to arrive from nearby towns. Fire brigades from Palmyra, Buga and Tuluá raced toward the city, their trucks sputtering through clouds of ash. Volunteers came on foot, bringing shovels, stretchers and cloth to cover the dead. The roads into Cali were clogged with carts carrying the injured. Every hospital overflowed within hours. At the San Juan de Dios hospital, the hallways were lined with makeshift beds, wooden doors, benches, even cardboard boxes. Doctors worked without rest. They performed surgeries by candlelight, their hands shaking from exhaustion. Supplies ran out before noon. No gauze, no bandages, no morphine. Nurses tore their uniforms into strips to wrap wounds. One young nurse later recalled, "It was like a battlefield." The people came in waves and burned, bleeding, crying for their children. We could not tell who was alive or who was already gone. Meanwhile, the army cordoned off the downtown district, fearing more explosions. There were rumours that not all the dynamite had detonated. Search teams moved cautiously through the rubble, listening for faint hissing sounds or the crackle of fire beneath the debris. Any spark, they feared, could ignite another chain reaction. By noon, the President of Colombia, General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, arrived by plane. From the air, he could see the full horror. 41 city blocks reduced to ash. As his motorcade passed through the shattered streets, the silence of the crowd said everything. No speech could match the grief that hung over the ruins. Survivors begged for news of missing relatives. Children wandered aimlessly, covered in dust, calling for their parents. The army began marking bodies with chalk, a number for each, before they were wrapped in sheets and carried to improvised morgues. By evening, the dead filled entire warehouses. The smell was unbearable. In the midst of the chaos, stories of unimaginable survival began to emerge. A newborn was found alive beneath a collapsed roof shielded by her mother's body. A tram conductor, blown from his vehicle, woke up 2 blocks away with only a broken arm. A night watchman at a nearby factory had been thrown clear of the explosion by a falling wall, a strange twist of fate that saved his life. But for most, there were no miracles. In some neighbourhoods, entire families were erased from the record. Their homes gone, their names never recovered. Churches lost their parishioners. Businesses vanished overnight. Cali's population fell silent under the weight of collective loss. Engineers surveyed the destruction and struggled to comprehend the force that had done it. The blast radius exceeded that of many wartime bombings. The crater was so large that it distorted the city's drainage patterns. Experts estimated that the explosion released energy equivalent to several kilotons of TNT, nearly the same as a small atomic bomb. And yet, it had not been an act of war. It was carelessness, neglect, the deadly intersection of bureaucracy and routine. As night fell on August 7th, the fires still burned. The city glowed red under the smoke, its once bright lights now replaced by the flicker of destruction. Survivors sat in the streets, wrapped in blankets, staring at what was left. In the faint light, it looked as if the city had been bombed from the sky. That night, the sound that haunted them most was not the explosion. It was the silence that followed. The stillness after the screams had faded. The quiet realization that their world had changed forever. Journalists from around the world began to arrive the next morning. Photographers waded through the debris, capturing images that would shock the international press. A child's shoe lying alone in the dust. A tram overturned beside a row of headless statues. Soldiers carrying bodies through smoke that never seemed to lift. Foreign correspondents compared the devastation to Hiroshima, a comparison that survivors found both horrifying and strangely fitting. The official death toll would remain uncertain for decades, but estimates ranged from 1,300 to over 4,000. Thousands more were injured, tens of thousands were left homeless. In Bogotá, government officials scrambled to contain public outrage. Questions filled the newspapers. Why had army trucks been parked in a densely populated area? Who had authorized their transport without proper safety measures? Where had the regulations failed? The answers were slow and often unsatisfying. Investigations revealed that the convoy had made multiple unscheduled stops during its journey. In towns where the drivers had taken rest breaks, sometimes near schools and homes. At every point, the danger had gone unnoticed. There were no national guidelines for the storage or transport of explosives. The tragedy in Cali was the result of a system built on habit, not safety, even as officials debated responsibility. The people of Cali faced a simpler truth. Their city, their families, their history, had been blown apart by their own government's negligence. In the weeks that followed, the smell of smoke lingered long after the fires went out. The ruins were still warm to the touch. Looters scavenged through the debris for anything of value, scraps of metal, pieces of furniture, sometimes even the clothes of the dead. The army patrolled the streets, rifles slung low, their faces blank with exhaustion. Cali would rebuild, but not quickly. The destruction of 41 city blocks meant years of reconstruction. For now, the survivors built shelters from corrugated tin and wood. They slept in the open air, unable to return to the homes that no longer existed. Every night, as darkness settled over the ruined city, the memories returned. The flash, the thunder, the unending fire. They had survived a man-made apocalypse, and no one could yet explain how or why it had been allowed to happen. The rescue and the aftermath. The hours after the explosion blurred into days. For those who survived, time lost all meaning. The sun rose and set behind a veil of smoke, turning the sky a sickly orange. The air was so thick with dust that it burned the throat to breathe. Every street was filled with a single sound, shovels striking rubble. Cali had become a city of rescuers. Men, women, even children joined in, digging through the debris with bare hands, searching for life beneath the ruins. Soldiers worked beside civilians, their uniforms torn and faces streaked with soot. At first, the hope was strong. People still believed there were survivors trapped below. They called out names into the wreckage, pausing to listen, straining for any reply. Sometimes they found it. A faint cry, a hand reaching through the dust. Those moments kept the effort alive, but more often they uncovered silence. The central crater where the explosion began was still smouldering, radiating heat like a furnace. Steel had melted into twisted ribbons, and the asphalt had bubbled like tar. Bodies recovered from the edges were barely recognizable, their features erased by the blast. Soldiers covered them with sheets, carried them to trucks, and drove them to makeshift morgues set up in churches and schools. Inside San Pedro Cathedral, rows of the dead were laid side by side, wrapped in white cloth. Priests moved quietly among them, sprinkling holy water, whispering prayers. Outside, families lined up in silence, clutching photographs, hoping to recognize a face. For many, there was nothing left to identify. No rings, no clothes, no trace at all. By the second day, international aid began to arrive. Planes landed in nearby airfields carrying medical supplies and food. The Red Cross set up tents where doctors treated burns and fractures in the open air. Colombia's neighboring countries sent money and volunteers. From Venezuela came blankets, from Panama antibiotics, from the United States crates of surgical equipment. But even the best supplies couldn't replace what had been lost: clean water, electricity, shelter, and above all, peace. The army imposed martial law to restore order. Looters had begun scavenging in the wreckage, and some soldiers, pushed beyond exhaustion, reacted with violence. Gunfire echoed through the ruined streets at night. Fear returned to the survivors, not from the explosion, but from what people might do when stripped of everything. In the hospitals, the wounded kept arriving. Their injuries were unlike anything the doctors had seen: deep burns, internal bleeding, lungs blackened by dust. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the stench of decay. Morgues overflowed. Corpses were stacked in corners, tagged with numbers when names were no longer possible. Refrigeration failed under the tropical heat. To prevent disease, mass graves were dug on the outskirts of the city. Bulldozers pushed earth over hundreds at a time. Still, the living pressed on. Mothers searched through refugee camps, calling out for children who never came. Workers gathered scraps of wood and sheet metal to build new shelters. Priests held outdoor services where entire neighborhoods knelt together, praying for the strength to rebuild. In Bogotá, the government launched an investigation. Committees were formed, reports drafted, responsibility passed from one department to another. But in the ruins of Cali, bureaucracy meant little. The people wanted answers, and none came. The army claimed the explosion was caused by an accidental spark. Officials called it a tragic coincidence, yet everyone knew it was more than that. For years, explosives had been transported without proper care, and no one had intervened. The disaster was the result of a pattern, one born of haste, neglect, and indifference. As journalists poured into the city, survivors told their stories. An elderly shopkeeper described waking up beneath his collapsed roof, trapped beside his wife, who never moved again. A schoolteacher spoke of digging for her students by lantern light. A soldier recalled being thrown 50 meters and waking up with his uniform burned away. Their voices filled the newspapers, each one adding to the collective portrait of tragedy. Photographs soon reached the international press, an entire block reduced to ash. A priest standing amid ruins holding a broken cross. A child covered in dust staring at the camera, with eyes too old for his age. Those images travelled farther than words could, and for the first time the world saw the scale of what had happened. Within a week the first funerals began. Coffins lined the streets, carried on trucks, carts, even on shoulders. Bells rang for hours each day, their sound echoing through the empty lots where houses once stood. For every name called, there were 10 unknowns. The ground itself seemed too heavy with loss to hold them all. The explosion also changed the rhythm of the nation. August 7th was already a holiday in Colombia, the anniversary of the Battle of Boyacá, a symbol of independence and triumph. That irony was not lost on anyone. On that same date, a century later, freedom's celebration had turned to mourning. As the days passed, attention turned to rebuilding. Engineers mapped the devastation, dividing it into zones of total loss. In some areas, it was impossible to reconstruct. The soil was contaminated with fuel and ash. The government promised funds and new housing, but progress was slow. For months, survivors lived under canvas tents in what became known as the City of Shadows. Psychologists would later describe the population as collectively traumatized. The survivors slept in short bursts, startled awake by phantom sounds, the echo of that first explosion repeating endlessly in their minds. Children stopped speaking for days. Adults refused to light stoves, terrified by the smell of fuel. And yet, amid the despair, something else grew, a fierce sense of solidarity. People who had lost everything shared what little they had. Strangers became family. Churches reopened as centers of refuge. Musicians played soft hymns among the tents at night. The people of Cali refused to let the explosion define them entirely as victims. Still, the wound cut deep. A city that had once been known for its rhythm, its laughter, its music, was now marked by a silence that felt sacred, even holy. The dead were not merely buried in the earth. They lived in every brick that would be laid in the years ahead. By the end of 1956, reconstruction had begun in earnest. Bulldozers cleared the crater, filling it with soil. Streets were redrawn, new buildings planned. Yet no one forgot what lay beneath. Beneath the pavement and the fresh concrete rested the remains of thousands, an unmarked grave that stretched across 40 blocks. For many, the rebuilding was both a physical and spiritual act, a declaration that life, however fragile, would go on. But for others, the scars were too deep to heal. Survivors spoke of hearing phantom cries at night. A mother swore she could still smell smoke when it rained. Every August, the city grew tense as the anniversary approached. The explosion had ended in seconds, but its aftermath would linger for generations. Cali's skyline, once a symbol of progress, had become a reminder of loss. The city had been reborn, but never the same. A lasting legacy. The ruins of Cali stood as a warning long after the fires went out. For weeks, the city was silent except for the distant hum of machinery and the cries of those still searching. Eventually the smoke cleared, and sunlight returned to the broken streets, but nothing about the light felt the same. It fell upon a city that had changed forever, one whose name would now be spoken in the same breath as the world's great catastrophes. When investigators from Bogotá arrived, they brought clipboards, cameras, and the authority of the state. They expected a mystery, perhaps an act of sabotage. Instead, they found something far more damning: the simplicity of negligence. The army had been transporting dynamite through civilian areas for years, without specialized vehicles, without fireproof containers, and without oversight. The convoy that night had been routed through Cali purely out of convenience. The drivers had stopped to rest because there was nowhere else to go. Every safeguard that could have prevented the explosion was missing, replaced by a habit and complacency. The official report published in 1957 concluded that an accidental fire had ignited the cargo. But those words did little to ease the anger. Newspapers accused the government of whitewashing the truth. The people of Cali demanded accountability, not excuses. Still, no one was prosecuted. The army issued a statement of regret and returned to its duties. The country moved on, at least on paper. Yet something had shifted beneath the surface. The explosion had exposed not just a failure of safety, but a moral reckoning. Colombia was entering the modern age, but the systems meant to protect its people were relics of another time. Engineers began drafting new regulations for the transport of explosives. Future shipments would require specialized storage, secure routes, and civilian oversight. The army reluctantly complied, its reputation shaken but intact. Cities across the nation reviewed their emergency response systems. Fire brigades trained for chemical fires. Hospitals stockpiled burn treatments. For the first time, a disaster preparedness entered the national vocabulary. Still, the reforms came too late for those already buried beneath the streets of Cali. In the years that followed, reconstruction transformed the landscape. Where the crater once lay, new streets were paved and buildings erected. The wounds of the explosion were covered with fresh concrete, as if the city were trying to erase its own memory. But memory has a way of seeping through. For decades, older residents refused to walk near the old explosion site after dark. They said the air there felt different, heavier, quieter. They avoided it not out of superstition, but out of respect. The ground beneath them had swallowed too many lives to tread lightly upon. By the early 1960s, Cali had regained its rhythm. The new downtown bustled with activity again. Music drifted from cafes, buses rolled along widened avenues, and the city's population swelled with migrants seeking opportunity. But underneath the new prosperity ran a current of unease. For those who remembered, every sudden noise carried the echo of that night. Writers began to chronicle the tragedy. Poems appeared in local newspapers, mourning the night of thunder. Songs were composed in memory of the lost. Journalists published testimonies from survivors who still carried the blast in their bones. One woman described the sound as a second sun. It rose in an instant and burned everything it touched. In 1976, 20 years after the explosion, the city held its first official commemoration. Thousands gathered near the site, now busy commercial district, to light candles and read the names of the known dead. Priests led prayers. The mayor spoke of the tragedy that forged our unity. Yet many felt the gesture hollow. There was still no monument, no museum, no central place to grieve. It would take nearly half a century for the city to fully acknowledge what had happened. In the late 1990s, as Colombia faced new waves of violence and instability, historians and journalists revived the story of the Cali explosion as a symbol of forgotten suffering. an early warning about the cost of indifference. The archives were reopened, the testimonies reprinted, and a new generation began to ask the same haunting question: how could a convoy of explosives be left in the middle of a city? By the 2000s, urban planners and cultural institutions finally began to treat the event as more than an accident. It became a chapter in the city's identity. Documentaries aired on television featuring black and white footage of the aftermath. Survivors, now elderly, shared their memories in trembling voices. They spoke not with anger, but with a quiet insistence that the story be remembered accurately, without embellishment or denial. For the families who lost everything, memory itself became the memorial. In homes rebuilt from the ashes, photographs of loved ones hung beside small crosses or candles. Children and grandchildren grew up hearing the same bedtime story told not to frighten them, but to teach them that carelessness, even unintentional, can destroy a city in seconds. Academics studying the disaster noted its far-reaching influence on Colombia's industrial policy. Regulations on mining, transport, and construction were rewritten over the following decades, each carrying the faint imprint of Cali's tragedy. And while the reforms were often unevenly enforced, they marked a turning point, a slow recognition that modernization required accountability, not just ambition. Yet beyond laws and logistics, the explosion left a deeper, more human legacy. It became a symbol of fragility, of how easily progress can turn to ruin when safety is treated as an afterthought. It reminded a nation that development without compassion, without attention, can be as destructive as war. In Cali, the story has never entirely faded. Every August, residents still gather to remember. Some bring flowers to the site, others simply pause in silence. The modern city hums around them. Traffic, neon lights, laughter. But for a few minutes each year, the noise softens. In that quiet, you can almost hear the echoes of 1956, the distant rumble, the shockwave, the unearthly silence that followed. In schools, teachers recount the event not only as history, but as a lesson in civic responsibility. The explosion, one educator wrote, was not born of evil. It was born of ordinary mistakes, multiplied by indifference. Those words became a refrain, a warning for a country that would face many more trials in the years ahead. As Colombia grew into the late 20th century, the scars of Cali's disaster receded into the background of a nation marked by larger conflicts. But to the people who lived through it, no war compared to that single night. They carried its memory quietly, in the rhythm of their lives, in the hesitation before lighting a match, in the way they looked toward the horizon whenever thunder rolled. Today, few visible traces of the explosion remain. The streets are paved, the buildings modern, the crater buried beneath layers of progress. Yet for those who know where to look, subtle signs endure, a small plaque near a church wall, a faded photograph in a shop window, an old man who still refuses to sleep through the anniversary night. The legacy of the Cali explosion is not written in monuments or museums. It lives in the consciousness of a city that learned the hard way that tragedy does not end when the smoke clears. It lingers in memory, shaping how people build, how they plan, and how they care for one another. And in that sense, the victims did not vanish into history. They became part of it. Silent witnesses reminding future generations that progress must never outrun precaution, and that even in peace, danger waits for those who stop paying attention.